Good morning. Hopefully you can hear us here. Thank you for coming along for those that are live with us at a very warm CIPD Festival of Work. I was just saying to David here, I'm quite glad I'm not doing the afternoon talk because I think the glass roof and the sun is only going to make it warmer here. But thank you for joining us and thank you for joining us online. So we are running a hybrid event here today like we did at Learning Technologies. So thank you for joining us there. Delighted to be joined by David today, the Director of Research for Fosway, where we're going to share a bunch of insights and thoughts around how to create a world-class content strategy. So we've been doing some work with Fosway on research about this topic. Naturally, we have a strong point of view on that, given the world that we operate in the sort of digital learning space. And we've got some great insights that hopefully will give you some either reassurance or some topics that you might want to continue to dive into. So just a quick bit of housekeeping. If someone hasn't already shared with you, we do have the opportunity to take some questions, both from our online group and also the people in front of us. I think for people in front, we could maybe just take them from you here, but also you can scan the QR code. So please join into the polls that we're going to go through, and we'll see how we go from there. So David, maybe hand over to you and give a sort of quick overview of why Fosway. How's the button working for you?
There we go.
And then we'll jump into
springs
it.
into life. If I get a little bit button clicky, that's because it's not doing what I thought it was. So hopefully I'll stay on track. I think we had a question for you almost straight off the bat to sort of, before we get into the research and reflect on some of the key messages that we started to distill from our questions around world-class content strategy. And really what I wanted to sort of get a sense of from you and our remote audience as well is how important digital learning is to your organization today. So is it critical part of what you do? Is it quite important? Is it not important, or don't you know? But if you can give us a sense of that in the survey that I think should be available through the link.
Yes.
So it'd be really nice to sort of get your feedback. Now, I think we get to see some of the results live as they come in.
A bit of a delay to come up, but yeah, so they'll come up, and perhaps just while that's coming through, at the end of this discussion, we'll be able to share with you how you can contribute to the survey and also get the research and the results that are coming out from it. And part of what we want to promote today is really the opportunity to hear your voice as well and be part of that. So hopefully it's coming up in front of us. It's coming up in front of us
now. And it initially came up as 100% critical, which I was wondering whether that was one or two votes. We don't need to do anymore. But I think that even just in terms of the profile, from sort of everything from it's not important or maybe don't know, for 3/4 of us who filled out this question already, it's critical. For 27% is quite important. I think if you'd have asked that question even 3 years ago, I think we might have had more quite importance than we had criticals. And I think people might have still been a little bit unsure about what was the right mix. But what we've managed to do over our research is start to uncover why it's critical, how people are using digital learning in organizations to make it most effective.
Yeah.
And that's what we're going to spend some time now talking through. So are we making these results available later?
Yeah, we can absolutely do that.
That's free and available. So we're going to play this back to you. Clicking on to the next slide, as he rapidly presses the button. Here we go. I may have gone too far. Here we go. So what we're going to do is just go through the high-level results and some of the key features that we've already picked out of our analysis. So what is the truth almost about corporate learning strategy or learning content strategy for 2022? What are the research headlines and what do you need to know? So some of these are pretty much already mirror what you've said, right? So one of the first questions we asked were, what problems is digital learning trying to solve in your organization? And we've got some items down here which talk about developer learning culture, reach a dispersed hybrid audience, scale learning delivery, greater L&D flexibility, need for cost reduction, offer a blend of learning, enhanced learning quality and effectiveness, and optimized investment. Now, what's interesting, why I've numbered some of these, is that what's come out as being the top reason that people are adopting digital learning is about reaching a dispersed audience, scaling delivery, providing greater L&D flexibility and agility, which is all the features that we see in technology and other parts of our business, right? So it's just an amplification of that. But what's really interesting is when you look at the numbers of people who said almost rated it number one first, learning culture was the number one, if that makes sense, right? And that's really interesting because people are looking at digital learning to enable a learning culture in their organization. And I think if we think that's the vehicle, we probably need to reflect on what other things we need to do to make that a reality. Because content on its own won't be an enabler of a learning content strategy. It needs to fit into a wider learning approach. Whether that's about things like career management, having conversations with managers around your performance today, getting peer-to-peer feedback, maybe more human processes that then trigger an interaction with learning content.
I think that's consistent, David, with what we see with our customers that we talk to. People talk about we want to improve or we want to change our learning culture. And I also say pretty much what you said there, that buying any more content is not going to necessarily change that. And also, how do you measure that that's been achieved? There's not a barometer that says, do we or don't we have a learning culture? There might be, I'd love to hear some challenge to that and what some of the solutions to that are, which is why I think the driver of what we've seen more recently in the last couple of years, an increased hybrid or dispersed workforce, has been the main driver. And I think what was perhaps most interesting out of this, and we talked about this before, is that the least the least highest reason of why people chose to invest in digital was for cost. So I think a number of years ago, digital from face-to-face was a cost choice, whereas now people are not seeing it as a cost benefit. It's got its own value in the learning ecosystem.
Exactly. And I think if we went back probably 10 years ago, it was like, well, we've got all this face-to-face training going on, it needs to scale, we want to reduce costs. But now it's very much, actually, we've moved beyond that into a place where digital is a way for us to create the reach and the distance and the immediacy and the speed of response at scale around probably our most important challenge as organizations, which is actually getting people to learn to prepare themselves for tomorrow. And that tomorrow is moving really, really fast. So I think that's really refreshing, but it puts some pressure on us to get the right answers, right, as well. The other thing is just in terms of where is digital learning being used. So we asked, is it in operational roles? Is it in project and change management audiences? Is it in technical professions? Is it in customer-facing employees, IT, finance, leadership, and sales at the end? And what you've got are the colors in terms of high priority being in red, and then the pink being medium priority and low priority being gray, and then where it's not applicable is in that sort of dark gray. The pattern that comes out is actually the red bit applies to everybody. So from sales to leadership to technical to customer facing, everybody's being touched by digital learning, which is a huge change, right? Again, it used to be, well, it's just about the technical staff. It's just about the IT guys. Maybe there's some particular leadership groups, but it's only part of the answer. What I think this shows us is actually it's being applied to everybody. And maybe that goes back to the regional thing about culture, reach, scale, immediacy. All these things start to come together. And again, it's the operational side of things, which is really interesting as well, because what that shows is, if it's about operational work, it probably means about our processes, it's about the way our products, how we get things done here. And maybe that sort of helps you think, actually, that's why it's so central and why it's so critical, why we had 75% or 74% say, actually, it's critical. Because it's enabling things really in the organization. And again, I think back in the day, if you went back maybe 4 or 5 years, people would have said, oh, digital learning is just for the other stuff. Right? Now it's front and center, and this is probably a good example of where. One of the areas where it's a little bit lower, finance, I'm not sure about why. Anybody work in finance? Maybe not in the room here. But I think there are some things around some of the technical expertise around that area, maybe not such a big topic. Sales, I think there's a strong sense that sales is a very practical experience. So you need to focus on the learning through doing, and it's the rehearsal and practice with people that really drives great sales expertise. And that's your domain expertise. I think that shows a bit of a skew, but it's there with everything, right? And
I think what we do see there is customers using sales online training for maybe sort of more of the process and the methodology piece, and therefore that's a smaller part of some of the transformation, whereas the operational roles, there's a lot more content available to be able to serve those needs.
So already we've got this sort of bigger picture of super important, being applied everywhere, to probably the most important things that happen in organizations, and also in terms of the hybrid workforce. Now, just to sort of do a straw poll here, are people working in a flexible environment in where they work? Yeah, everybody, right? So actually, how do you then reach that audience when you can't guarantee they're going to be in the office? Maybe they will come into the office or come into your locations to do training, but you need the flexibility if you want things to happen fast. We know in the past, right, when you did inductions for new starters, you had to wait maybe 3 or 4 months before people pitched up to do their induction, which they should have had in the first week. Actually, that reach and scale is something that digital does really well. And what we're seeing here is that actually when you say about the devices that people are working on, actually laptops number one, which makes sense because people are sat at home working on their laptops as much as anything, desktop less, and then you've got the mobile. Say 75% of organizations saying that mobile is a point of interaction with digital learning content. And again, that's huge, right? So that probably means a little bit of travel, learning on the commute. Sometimes when I'm remote, flicking through, it doesn't specify what type of device, whether it's an iPad or a tablet or a phone, but it helps you think about maybe your content as well, right? Because it needs to be able to fit onto all the different sorts of formats. In the past, we'd have just said, let's deliver it to a big screen. It needs to work across all screens now. The other side is just where people are learning from. And the workplace is 93%, but for most of us, that's also home, which is 83%. And actually in the field, people who are learning remotely, maybe because their job is a field engineer or something, half say that they're interacting with those sorts of things as well. So again, it's reaching everybody. And I think that's what the sort of thing is, that sort of going back to there aren't any boundaries. And I think that's one of the key things around digital learning. It removes many of the boundaries. And the issue then is how good is the experience that it really creates change in what we know, maybe our sense of behavior and our attitudes and how we actually perform. And maybe that's something we need to think a little bit more about. The other thing is just the scale of change, right? And I know everybody here will probably just it's probably worth just putting this up just to reflect a little bit on when we see the amount of change that's happening in the transformation of organizations through digital transformation, new services, new products. These things are immense. We've got changes in regulation. So when you think about new systems, new products, new markets that you're trying to reach out to, because it's now all about digital product set, these things don't happen in isolation. They happen as combinations. So when you get a change in market, you get a change in regulation, you get a change in product, you get a change in leadership, maybe you get a change in roles, you get a culture shift because you're doing things maybe more as a virtual experience for your customers than used to. All these things create a ripple of effect. And I think this just gives you a little bit of an indication of what we're doing this is to try and drive great knowledge, great skills, great behaviors. And that means we have to think about learning input, we have to think about practice, and we need to think about collaboration. And I think that starts to come out in some of the other research. But what I want to put this up for is just to sort of highlight the range and depth of sorts of experience that you're trying to put your people through when they're going through learning. And I think we can sometimes forget that a little bit. Just the other thing is just this sense of reskilling and upskilling. It seems to be probably one of the most significant trends in organizations currently. We're seeing that across all industries. And that comes out in the research. So the number one sort of driver around adopting digital learning is around driving upskilling, reskilling. It's about enabling that learning culture, as you said before. Regulatory compliance, which probably would have been number one before the pandemic, is slipped down the table. And again, I think that shows how we're thinking about digital learning as being that critical enabler that we highlighted right at the beginning.
Yeah, that's definitely what we're seeing with our customers. And I think the other point that we've sort of come on to is where that content's being used or how it's being used. Certainly not as a standalone solution anymore where compliance was perhaps traditionally used. It's now how do we use that part of a blend? How do we add some of the user-generated content and make it really part of this sort of overall sort of learning, fabric of learning content that they're trying to deliver.
And I think some of the other things to pick out of here, which are really quite interesting, is that sense of the things on the right-hand side around growth mindset. So using digital learning to encourage a growth mindset, thinking about personal effectiveness, thinking about health and safety. I think the ones around growth mindset and personal effectiveness, I think the challenge for us is to think about how might we interweave some of those courses and resources, things that we've got bought as our resource set into that growth mindset. What would we do? Would we send out a whole initiative? Would we shape a whole initiative for our organization, which is around challenging people to think about where their future is, what their aspirations are, what's their priorities with their manager around developing their career and their skills? that's the sort of thing where you're trying to release some of that sort of desire to learn, which comes back to that learning culture. I think there's many things, but the content won't deliver these things. It's how you embed the content and the support activities into your broader learning programs and the triggers, the touch points, which will really drive great learning and transformation. Okay, so next thing, just in terms of how people use off-the-shelf content. So we ask people, when you have off-the-shelf content, how do you use it within your organization? And I think, again, this comes back to what Ollie said around, number one, we use it as part of a blend. We use it to help accelerate and add depth and richness to maybe our face-to-face courses or manager coaching or peer-to-peer coaching or just on-the-job learning. And again, that's really critical because that helps you think about what are the big transformations in our organization and how are we going to embed this in a purposeful way into that learning journey of input, action, feedback, and reflection, right? A very human process which uses the digital as a stimulus, right? And you've got the upskilling and reskilling, you've got that whole area around career development, performance management, and using it as a standalone catalog was the last rated reason. And I think that's something to take away, right? If you're buying into digital resources, you're buying into a digital learning partner, don't think of it as just sitting in a catalog. Think about how you are purposefully going to intertwine it into your blends, into upskilling, into career development. There's a really nice sweet spot when you start to overlay these together. And if you can get managers to talk about that with their people, where's your career going? What learning is your part of your agenda? When are we going to create space for you to do that learning? So you can start to step up in our organization, which is going through all these huge changes, and it becomes really exciting. So I don't know if we move on, or you...
No, I think we've covered that well.
Yeah. So the other thing is just in terms of where people are accessing content as well. So we asked people, how do you access digital learning content in your organization? And we said, is it from a learning experience platform, an LMS, or a learning portal? Is it through collaborative learning tools or collaborative tools, actually more generally, things like Microsoft Teams or Slack? Are you using it through a performance management or coaching solution? Are you embedding it in HR processes? And is it part of performance support, or is it in the flow of work? And what comes out is there's a big push to access learning, not just through the traditional point of a learning platform, but through other places that may be closer to the place of work. So that whole thing about picking up content while you're in Slack or Microsoft Teams. If your system isn't pushing it there, then you're not, to use a phrase that I used to work with somebody who could say, you're not where the eyeballs are. And for anybody who wants to get things consumed, you have to have people's eyeballs on it, right? So if you are where the people naturally are, then that adoption of content, the use of content grows always, right? So actually that's a really interesting change. The other side of this around performance management, what happens in your performance management processes today? How is that changing to make sure that you provide people more support? What conversations are your leaders having with their teams? As you start to embed learning in those conversations, is moving naturally closer to work. So it's something for us to think about as a whole approach, purposefully almost weave the learning into the employee experience. And that makes a lot of difference.
Absolutely.
Okay, so next slide. And just to say that sort of sense of it becoming more collaborative, we've always sort of used this image as a way of sort of representing maybe where learning used to happen as a formal part of delivery, and how actually it needs to reach into the workplace and reach into collaboration. But to some extent, there's always overlaps in each one of these things. So you can have a learning program which is about having a job assignment, which is a purposeful learning program which is supported by formal learning content. But actually lots of things that we want to happen really form part of that workplace learning activity. So it's about mentoring, it's about feedback, it's about performance support, and that's where that overlap into that sort of more workplace-focused learning really happens. So I think it's really interesting, I think, that this sense of, in the past, we'd have thought about learning content only being delivered through learning experiences. That's still high in the ratings, but actually it's that right-hand side of the diagram which is starting to grow. So we need to think a little bit about that when we're thinking about both our learning content strategy and our learning approach. The other one that I think is really interesting, this has come out of the survey, is what sorts of learning content are people using for different types of learning? So again, our chart shows things that are related to business products, business processes, our organization and culture, then into technical skills. And then as you move to the right, it starts to touch on compliance and leadership and business skills and diversity, inclusion and belonging, soft skills, health and safety, and IT on the right-hand side. What we've done is in each one of those columns, we've represented, is this content that is user-generated? Is this content that you bought which is off the shelf? Or is this content which is bespoke to you? And you see this sort of natural balance almost on the right-hand side where it's more generic skills. It's the off-the-shelf content in orange which shows up. And that starts to decline as you go to things that are much more specific to your organization. Now, to some ways, that's sort of no surprise. But what is a surprise maybe is actually, even when it's bespoke things that are very naturally unique to your organization, there is the opportunity to build in off-the-shelf content. And then if you look at some of the other mechanisms, so things like bespoke content, when it's more generic skills on the right-hand side, there's less things. Maybe it's more focused on how we execute here. Whereas when you get over to the left-hand side, it's very much about, actually, if it's about our products, we're always trying to create more bespoke content, or unique content ourselves to support that. And I think the other thing is just this green layer, which is the user-generated. And that sort of filters its way through. So that you can think about that as maybe, how do we do things here? The user's view, which can be used either to excite people to say, actually, I quite like the idea of how that works, or just a really rapid way of expressing, actually, this is how we get things done here. And it's really quick because actually we can shoot a video in a few minutes.
I think that's an interesting point. We're really starting to see the trend of user-generated content increasing. Yeah. And I think it was, you had quoted, like we're all digital content providers in some form. Yeah. And the capability and the sort of accessibility internally within organizations is really driving that. Yeah. And I think we can continue to see that trend. And we're talking later on in the conference around curation and how the integration of those three different types of content is a critical part. And I think to go back to your wheel before, I think that's just goes to demonstrate how complex the L&D landscape is for L&D professionals. So how do you piece all of that together? How do you align what content's most appropriate for which solution? And I think that's the interesting part that perhaps we can come on to in given the research, which is we can share more of. But how do we start the journey of answering some of the questions in response to the challenges?
So, and again, that creator economy comes out when we ask people, where do you expect to invest more in digital learning content in the year ahead? This isn't saying how much they're going to invest, but where people's intention to invest more is. User-generated content comes out strongly, right? And you can see that almost playing out as it sort of represents that creator economy that Ollie was talking about, but also it sort of picks up this sense of, I can capture it quickly and I can use it to market the program. I can send out these teaser elements, as you might do through TikTok and Instagram, to say, this just gives you a flavor of what you can learn if you go through the wider program. So it's not just as a tool to convey knowledge and provide learning in its own right. It can be a stimulus in part of your marketing campaigns around learning as well, right? And when you see your own people that you see around you every day saying, this is great, actually that whole sense of peer-to-peer advocacy is really important in driving adoption. We'll show that a little bit later. But this comes out of the data, it sort of shows this move. But overall, every area of digital learning content, people are saying, yeah, I'm going to invest more around. So, got a question for you. Again, we're going to do this as a quick poll, which is, how effective is your learning strategy? Whoops, I can't read that. Next slide, please, so we can see. There we go. Oh, I've gone too far. Okay, so how effective is your learning strategy at delivering the skills and expertise your organizations needs to be successful for tomorrow? So we've got sort of a few criteria in here around, is it very effective, quite effective, or is it ineffective? Again, really interesting to get your sense around this. How effective is your learning strategy at delivering the skills and expertise your organization needs to be successful for tomorrow? 100% effective, quite effective. I thought for a moment everybody's going to say it was wonderful. Very effective, got 50-50 split. Still a 50-50 split. Actually, maybe we just leave it to run for a little bit.
Yeah, we can give that a bit of time. Very effective.
Very
We've got some very capable teams amongst us by the looks of it, which is good. I think you can't miss the conversation on skills. I think is the context.
Exactly.
learning technology a few months ago, and it's sort of absolutely the current currency, and the technology providers and organisations really trying to tackle this. So if we are ineffective, then we've definitely got a good segue into hopefully David to share some where do we start if we are ineffective, or how do we benchmark what we are doing to be very effective to move forward?
So I'm just going to quickly, we started off as a really high point and things rapidly have gone a little bit downhill in terms of the results, which, to be fair, isn't unexpected, right? And we've done some sort of parallel research, sort of moving on to the next slide, which is a bit indicative of this. And I think what we've tried to say is we've said to people, how effective is your learning strategy at doing compliance? How good is it at personal development, onboarding, learning culture? And the thing is the green, right? When you're saying, actually, we're really effective. We're very effective. Now, the reason I put that as a benchmark is if you didn't have a very effective sales team, people would be asking questions. And equally, probably as much as we question our sales team or our IT support, whatever function it is, L&D probably need to live and die by similar metrics, right? We need to be running an A-class, A1 game. But what you see is typically, well, if that's 20% line here, in most things we're less than 20% effective. So that it came back, learning culture at 17% isn't much different from the 500 people we asked more broadly. And they said it's only about 22% said their learning culture is really effective, right? So there's some nice synergies. Don't feel bad about this. But what's really interesting to me is actually we can raise our game. We need to think differently. Only 1 in 3 think they're effective in anything other than compliance. So we need to do better, right? And that means a little bit more investment, a little bit more thinking forwards about how we use technology to enable us to get there. And we need to rely on good partners to do that. We can't, because many of our teams are so small, do that alone. We need to find good partners to help us scale. So how do you create a world-class learning strategy, and content, especially around learning content? How do you make it happen? I'm going to quickly go through some really simple things. Maybe they're too obvious, but they're so grounding and so foundational that we cannot cover them. The first is connect with why, right? If you don't have a strong connection with your stakeholders around the why, then you will fail, right? Now, there's a series of whys. There's a why because I want to be operationally, as a learning team, more effective. There's about improving performance, as what we do as an organization today. And there's a why around enabling strategic change in our organization. So what does our organization need to be tomorrow? Now, you need to be having these conversations with your senior stakeholders to understand where you need to focus your effort, where your learning content needs to be connected and your learning programs need to be connected to drive the future of your organization. You can start to set benchmarks, you can have measures of success around that. But if you're not tied into these level 5 ones that I've called them at the top, you're much more transactional, you're much more vulnerable to having your budgets cut. Money appears when you're driving performance and you're facilitating the future of the organization. Your stakeholders will give you money to make that happen. And I know that from experience. I worked in an organization that went through Chapter 11. Effectively, an organization has become bankrupt. There is no money, you think. When you go and speak to the customer services director about what they need to improve, they find you money. When you talk to the sales teams around what they want to improve, because they still want to hit their targets, right? They give you money. So you can use this as an engagement strategy to fund your learning. And this also puts you right in the center of the future of the organization as well. So it's a great way of driving investment. So you know what your stakeholders' priorities are. The other is to connect with who you're trying to educate or who you're trying to develop, right? So what are they doing? And some of that is contextual, right? So there is a driver around driving performance now. And that means there's maybe a slightly different set of learning interventions than the success you want to drive for tomorrow. So if you think about when we had that sort of the bar saying, actually, is it about your organization or is it generic skills? Some of this stuff over here is much more about your organization. And you've got to think about how can I do performance support? How can I do social performance management? That's just giving people peer-to-peer reviews, giving people feedback on their day-to-day work. How do you provide bite-sized learning that just gives them enough at the right time? How can you support performance management? How can you drop in some learning, which is the right thing, just to drive performance today? The next one is about driving strategic development. So where do we want the organization to be tomorrow? What skills do we need to develop? What career paths do we want to enable? And that enables you to create a whole new set of learning paths, new learning experiences. So things to, and then there's just this final area, which is really important around learning culture, which is trying to drive curiosity in your organization as well. So those are the things. If you know your context, know your audience, what their drivers are, it becomes easier to map the content to them. And you get this sort of sense of that in the past, you used to just think about learning as being a broadcast mechanism. It used to be about how can we market direct to people, we're doing an initiative. Actually, it's about tying it, like we said right at the beginning, into things about what do we know about people's skills, how do we tie it into the conversations around people's performance management conversations with their managers, how do we tie it into their future around what jobs they want to do next. All these things start to come together to drive people's learning behaviors. And if you've got permission to learn, because you create space, actually you have a learning culture. If you don't allow people to have space to learn, because actually you're just maxing them out all the time, you won't create a learning culture. People will just say, there's no point. If it doesn't give me a connection to my future job, there's no point. So, and then you just think about the touch points, right? These touch points around strategic learning touch points is just, when you're thinking about developing me in my next role, show me the learning at that point, not somewhere else. So, the final one is just to connect to where and how people learn. And I think just the sense of learning experience, we talked about this a little bit before, about where learning happens, workplace learning, collaborative. Being much more workplace focused means that you drive a much different learning experience. And actually you just think about how the content complements. And I love this quote from Amanda at Ketchum. She talks about, we're focusing on how we make Ketchum a long-term, attractive career home where folks have many opportunities to move up and around the organization in different teams and projects. That starts with embedding learning and skills building in people's day-to-day learning experiences. Now, Ketchum are using that to attract your people who work in your organization. So there's almost an arms race of making sure that your learning, the way you present learning in your organization, in context, next to people as part of their day-to-day experience, through coaching, through popping up learning that's relevant. These things are really important if you want to drive learning engagement. And that's what your competitors are doing, and they will steal your people if you're not doing the same. So there is a whole arms race around this that's just taking place. What we know overall is that actually people aren't great at delivering great learning experiences. So those people who start to steal a march on their competitors have the unfair advantage, whether that's around collaborative learning, doing marketing campaigns around learning to drive people's adoption, whether it's about learning nudging, whether it's about workflow learning, all these things. There is such a level of immaturity around what people are doing that actually you can steal a march if you start to overinvest in this area. So, and finally, just to say, it's about connecting with who energizes learning, and I'll just pick this out as, next slide. Really, I'm just going to focus on the right-hand side, right? People think that learning is complicated in terms of the process of learning. It is really simple. It's about input, it's about enabling people to take action, which is practice, usually in the workplace, doing a real thing, getting feedback, and encouraging them to take some reflection about what input they should get next. Now, that input can come from digital learning resources, courses. It can come from the person who sits next to you. It can come from a mentor. It can come from a coach. It can come from loads of different sources. Just come from watching a video on YouTube, right? But the important thing is how you then embed that into the actions that people then take to show that they've improved, and giving them that sort of sense of somebody's helping you and is going to give you some feedback about how you can improve next time. And that doesn't have to be a manager. It can be the person who sits next to you. It can be a mentor. It could be a customer. All these things provide you with a framework. And actually, when you see it as just being the input, the content being as one step out of four, you can see how actually you can drive a really interesting learning experience for people without too much effort. It's something that people should be able to power themselves. Really, it's a learning process. And finally, those things come together. If you attach the value to the context, to a mixed solution, which is embedded in the work as much as it is in formal learning, and you think about how you energize learning through people, and don't just think, actually, I'm going to send people to study alone on their own, but get them to work together to show and rehearse, then you get some real energized learning as well. And that's our challenge, right? When we think about learning design, it's not about the instructional design of how you complete the task. It's how you support people in their behavioral journey from taking where they are today to what they need to be able to do tomorrow. And this sort of gives you a little bit of a framework. So the content, whether you source that from a partner, whether you develop it yourself, is all part of that mix. And you can see almost how some of this sort of show that you know, energizing people to show that they know, is all part of that TikTok user-generated content of, this is what I've just done. Isn't that amazing? You share that with teams, share that with other people in your organization, excite other people to participate. So that's the end. Just to say quality matters. And the reason it really matters is the number one driver of why people will participate in your training programs and your resources is because of peer-to-peer recommendation. That's not a star against the course. It's when somebody says, that is brilliant, have a go yourself. And that's it. So I've probably gone over.
No,
hopefully that gives us a little bit of time for some Q&A. But
as always, we could listen to you for a long time, though.
Oh dear, I've gone on too much.
I think a couple of things to sort of wrap up. Firstly, we'll definitely take some questions, but also please feel free to contribute to the survey. We're running that for another month, and then we will be sharing the results and some sort of practical tools and techniques that come off the back of that. So there's a couple of questions here to put us on the spot. The first one: how do we think content strategy should pivot when there's an economic downturn? It's a great question. I was chatting to a couple, my boss yesterday actually, who's over from Australia, and I think specifically content strategy, we have to overinvest in learning in this downturn. I think the sort of general consensus is that, yes, we are going to face an economic downturn, but perhaps there's other areas that will be traditional, that would be traditionally reduced in budget. So learning and marketing was always the sort of old adage, but I think people now are maybe reducing investment in growth, when maybe that's sales or other technologies, but continuing to invest in skills, because as David said, to your point, if you don't, there's going to be other people that are, and they're going to be taking your staff in the great resignation, or whatever the latest phrase is for sort of migration of people's staff. So I think that's what I would say. Not just selfishly because we run a content business, because it's not just about the content, but invest in your people in whatever format. But I don't know if you've got any other comments to that.
For me, I think we've been here before. We had the financial crash of 2008, 2009. What we know, if we look back to those days, is the people who invested in learning accelerated out the other side of the recession faster, and they were more successful. So now is the time to invest, both to keep your people, but also to power you into the next phase whenever that upturn happens. The other thing is just in terms of the availability of people. Overall, we know, I think last month was the first time when the number of vacancies exceeded the number of available people to fulfill those vacancies. So if your people leave, it's not a binary thing of we just get somebody in. You may struggle to get somebody in. So you have to focus relentlessly on keeping your people. And the other thing is, actually, the world's not going to stop still because we're going through a recession. The people who come through those recessions fastest are the ones who innovate fastest. They explore new markets. They think about new technologies. Sometimes that downsizes their organization, but they embrace change. And embracing change means building new skills. So actually, the organizations that want to survive well will invest in good content and think about how they are growing their business, because it's still there to grow, even in downtimes. So that's what sticks.
And I think the other question here is about internal mobility platforms and how that can drive adoption. I think that sort of leads nicely on to if we're not supporting individuals' internal mobility, then they may exit. We were talking earlier about there's several mobility solutions, and we're working with one particularly where how does digital learning or learning content get applied to the skills and the jobs are required. But there's probably a long answer to that. But David, maybe you could give us a quick summary as the expert in that space.
It's huge for me. I think it's something that is really based around people intelligence in a way that we've not really touched on before. And what that means is we are able to personalize the sorts of employee experience that we can offer to people in a way that we've never had before as well. So I think internal mobility platforms, because they typically embrace not just roles, they also embrace gigs and projects, are something that will be super important, especially when you think about how do we educate our people to be better in new areas that they aspire to work around. It really brings lots of things together, and I think they could really disrupt the learning market and learning platforms market hugely.
Great. I'm conscious of any other questions that are here. Some of these may have been online. I've got Natalie with a microphone. If there's any other questions or points of interest here, otherwise, I'll thank you for listening. Thank you for taking the time, and look forward to sharing the research as that is more published, and would love to chat to you more if you wanted to find out more about how we can support you. And thank you for joining online as well, not to forget those attendees. So, and David, thanks again for taking the time.
A pleasure as always.
Appreciate
Thank you so much.
Thank you.